The marriage of King Charles III and Princess Diana was once the epitome of a royal fairy tale. But behind the gilded facade of the monarchy lay a turbulent story of heartbreak, betrayal, and hidden struggles. From Diana's private battles with mental health to the shadow of infidelity that loomed over their union, the secrets King Charles reportedly tried to bury reveal a deeply human tragedy beneath the grandeur of the crown. Why did Diana spiral into despair while living under the spotlight of the world's admiration? How did Charles navigate his dual roles as a royal heir and a husband unable to provide the love his wife craved? And what were the events and revelations that exposed the cracks in a marriage that changed the British monarchy forever? In this video, we uncover 15 shocking secrets King Charles III allegedly sought to hide. Secrets that go beyond the surface to unravel the complexities of a marriage that shaped an era. Stay tuned as we delve into the untold truths of a union that mesmerized the world, only to end in heartbreak and tragedy. From the moment Diana joined the royal family, she struggled to conform to the austere environment that demanded controlled behavior and near-perfect public relations. One of the earliest wounds came from a careless remark Charles allegedly made about her weight. He reportedly labeled her a bit chubby, not expecting the comment to leave such a deep imprint. This passing criticism became the trigger for Diana's bulimia, which spiraled due to the unrelenting public gaze on her figure and the monarchy's unspoken demand that she appear flawless. Court insiders would eventually speak of how she became locked in cycles of binging and purging, desperately trying to manage her feelings of powerlessness through control of her body. While bulimia was not well understood in early 1980s Britain, especially not within palace walls, her condition worsened in part because it was dismissed as a passing phase or a ploy for attention. Consequently, no real safety net existed for her. Over time, the emotional toll of bulimia blended with a deeper desolation that led Diana to attempt suicide on multiple occasions. Perhaps the most shocking episode was her throwing herself down a staircase while pregnant with Prince William, an act that risked not just her life but that of the unborn heir. Fragmentary accounts of that day paint a harrowing scene. A young princess in tears, convinced her pleas for help fell on deaf ears. Some historians suggest that the palace, so concerned with outward dignity, had no established protocol for dealing with an emotionally distressed future queen. Diana later confessed to cutting herself with razors in moments of despair, leaving visible scars that mirrored her invisible emotional wounds. In the broader context of the mid-1980s, when mental health was rarely spoken of openly, a princess grappling with suicidal ideation and self-harm was deeply discomforting to those within the royal household. Charles, perhaps unprepared and lacking the emotional education to respond, reportedly distanced himself further, missing many opportunities to address her anguish compassionately. This disconnect between a young woman crying out for help and a husband trained to maintain a dignified silence underpinned the continuing tragedy. Charles, who had spent his life under intense scrutiny, possessed a certain reticence in emotional matters. The monarchy had taught him the maxim never complain, never explain, a principle dating back to Queen Victoria's era. In time, he sought professional therapy for his own mounting stress and acknowledgement of his personal difficulties. From a modern standpoint, this move might be applauded. It was unusual for a British royal to disclose or admit to therapy. However, Diana perceived his discreet therapy visits as evidence of a double standard. He was permitted to seek solace privately, while she was expected to endure her burdens quietly. Her emotional struggles often minimized or belittled. This dynamic reinforced her sense of betrayal. As Diana's mental fragility and frustration grew, Charles's separate emotional world hardened. Eventually, the friction eroded the marriage to such an extent that bitterness spilled over into public spats. Protocol demanded unity at official engagements, smiling faces, polite gestures, the quintessential royal facade. Yet more than once, the simmering tension boiled over for all to see. Journalists covering royal tours noted occasions where Diana's body language was openly defiant, or Charles appeared visibly exasperated by her unexpected remarks. Such moments, amplified by the press, fed rumors that something was very wrong behind palace doors. With paparazzi perpetually lurking, every sign of discord turned into headline news. Charles reportedly found these scenes mortifying, while Diana, lacking any other avenue, believed that confronting him publicly might finally elicit a response. Instead, it only deepened the cycle of conflict, intensifying media frenzy. Eventually, Charles and Diana led increasingly separate lives. By the late 1980s, Charles had retreated to Highgrove House, a countryside estate where he immersed himself in his beloved hobbies, such as polo, gardening, and painting. This rural sanctuary provided an escape from London's scrutiny and from Diana's presence. Meanwhile, Diana remained at Kensington Palace, channeling her energies into charitable engagements. She visited hospitals, consoled AIDS patients when the broader public still harbored irrational fears, and used her new brand of compassionate royalty to connect with those neglected by society. But the gulf between her philanthropic success and her failing marriage only magnified her isolation. Tabloids speculated that Charles and Diana were essentially living two entirely different lives, something once unthinkable for the monarchy, but now impossible to hide. Behind the scenes, Diana also grew resentful of Charles's close-knit circle of friends. Many were aristocrats who had known him since childhood, some loyal to Camilla Parker Bowles, a figure who loomed large as an alleged long-standing romantic partner. Diana's hostility toward these friends sometimes manifested in abrupt orders and demands. According to multiple anecdotal accounts, she even insisted that Charles remove his beloved dog, Harvey, from the household because she viewed anything associated with his past as a threat. Her fervor for control in this domain, though it might seem harsh or petty, underscores just how wounded she felt. In her eyes, these old alliances were complicit in sustaining a version of Charles that did not include her wholeheartedly. While outsiders might have seen her actions as overreactions, she viewed them as a last resort to claim some sense of power in a marriage where she believed her happiness was sidelined by tradition and loyalty to old relationships. At the same time, Diana was deftly navigating the media landscape. Even before British tabloid culture reached its present-day intensity, the press recognized a star quality in her that sold millions of papers. She quickly learned how to cultivate public favor, granting select journalists off-the-record insights or cooperating with certain biographers. Her portrayal of herself as an isolated, unappreciated wife resonated with the public, who grew increasingly sympathetic to her plight. In contrast, Charles, bound by royal tradition, largely avoided explaining himself publicly. When he did speak, it was in measured, stilted statements. His reticence to engage in the media game left the field wide open for Diana to shape the narrative. Some observers felt her approach was manipulative, but others argued it was the only means she had to be heard in a system determined to stifle any hint of discontent. In the early 1990s, Diana's paranoia took a dramatic turn. She became convinced that there were deliberate efforts to sedate her, making her docile enough to comply with palace rules. Although evidence for such a conspiracy was never conclusively provided, her intense fear is telling. She felt so cornered that even routine medical assistance could appear sinister. Her diaries, as reported later, hinted at her belief that telephones were tapped, letters intercepted, and staff members paid to report on her private moments. These claims, though they may sound extreme, must be contextualized within her lived reality. She was under constant paparazzi siege, with photographs of her leaving gyms and hotels plastered across tabloids daily. Unauthorized recordings, such as the Camilla Gate tapes that were leaked in 1993, prove that private communications could indeed become public property. If Charles's intimate phone calls with Camilla were fair game for eavesdroppers, Diana had reason to suspect her own conversations might not be safe. Charles's eventual admission of adultery in a 1994 documentary was for Diana a devastating confirmation of her worst suspicions regarding Camilla Parker Bowles. Despite widespread speculation in aristocratic circles for years, hearing Charles speak candidly about the affair on television delivered an emotional blow from which the marriage could never recover. In the public mind, it cemented Diana's portrayal as the deeply wronged wife, sparking global empathy for her predicament. It also cast Charles as a reluctant spouse who had gone through with a marriage to fulfill dynastic needs, but had never relinquished his bond with Camilla. The monarchy, relying on carefully maintained illusions of unity, struggled to address the fallout, leading to strained statements from Buckingham Palace that neither clarified the situation nor eased the controversy. When Queen Elizabeth II advised Charles and Diana to separate, it represented a seismic shift. For centuries, the British royal family strove to maintain the sanctity of royal unions, discouraging even the notion of divorce. But the Queen, who had weathered many storms in her own marriage to Prince Philip, apparently perceived that this crisis threatened the very stability of the monarchy. According to reports, her decision stood in stark contrast to earlier attempts to conceal or deny the seriousness of Charles and Diana's marital woes. Diana, hoping the Queen might validate her distress, felt doubly betrayed. She saw the official endorsement of separation as an implicit alignment with Charles's perspective, thus invalidating her claims of mistreatment and neglect. Desperate for a last glimmer of reconciliation, Charles and Diana even sought the help of the Archbishop of Canterbury. This institution, central to the Church of England, had long interwoven with the monarchy. The fact that a spiritual figure of such high rank was asked to intervene indicates how dire the situation had become. Yet hope was quickly dashed. Diana's disillusionment had reached a point of no return, and Charles's own frustration remained entrenched. The Archbishop, said to have recognized their unwillingness to meet each other halfway, could do little except acknowledge the chasm of distrust between them. This solemn involvement effectively illustrated that the monarchy's usual methods, discreet conversations, private family summits, gentle persuasion, were powerless in the face of such profound emotional wounds. In the midst of these battles, a single unifying thread persisted. Both Charles and Diana cared about the well-being of their sons, Prince William and Prince Harry. Although the marriage disintegrated around them, they occasionally collaborated on decisions regarding the boys. Friends close to the family have said that Charles sometimes conceded that Diana's maternal instincts proved invaluable in shaping William and Harry's upbringing. For moments, the broken couple managed glimpses of teamwork. Still, the conflict left a deep imprint on William and Harry, who recalled nights disrupted by arguments and the incessant glare of paparazzi. Both princes would later speak openly about the psychological difficulties they faced, culminating in Prince Harry's decision to step back from senior royal duties decades afterward, citing experiences that echoed his mother's challenges. Diana's mental deterioration did not abate after separation. Far from being a mere rough patch, her struggles with depression and emotional instability were chronic, aggravated by an unceasing media presence and the knowledge that Charles's affections were elsewhere. Those around her observed wild mood swings, sudden outbursts, and a creeping sense of hopelessness. She yearned to be loved within her marriage, but it was apparent that Charles's heart had long been with Camilla. The royal family, steeped in centuries of tradition and protocol, seemed unprepared or unwilling to adapt to the urgent mental health needs of a young princess. Diana's more erratic moments, accusations, confrontations, or tearful public appearances only fueled press sensationalism. Royal observers have noted that the monarchy never had a blueprint for handling a modern princess who openly displayed emotional vulnerability. One of the more intriguing insights from this period concerns Diana's efforts to curtail Charles's cherished hobbies. He had always found refuge in pursuits like polo and painting, which offered an escape from the pressures of public life. Diana, however, reportedly saw these activities as symbolic of his old loyalties and his continuing ties to people and places she resented, including those intertwined with Camilla. The push to ban or discourage Charles from engaging in these hobbies carried a dual significance. On one hand, it was a manifestation of her anger, a declaration that she refused to tolerate anything reminiscent of what she believed had undermined her marriage. On the other hand, it was a raw attempt to force him to reshape his identity around her needs, an impossible demand that further damaged what little remained of their bond. Royal commentators sometimes see this as an ironic twist. Diana, widely viewed as the victim, momentarily stepped into the role of aggressor by attempting to deprive Charles of activities that brought him solace. Yet from her perspective, the presence of those hobbies and the people associated with them stood as constant reminders that she was never truly integrated into his life. All these forces converged in a dramatic unraveling. The public spats, the confessions of infidelity, the paranoia, the separate living arrangements, the institutional silence. By the time Charles and Diana formally divorced in 1996, the fairy tale wedding had become a global soap opera. News outlets followed the saga with relentless fervor, culminating in speculation about how Diana would reinvent herself post-divorce. Although she lost her designation as Her Royal Highness, she retained a measure of public admiration that perhaps surpassed even the monarchy's. She ventured more boldly into charity work, traveling and raising awareness about issues ranging from leprosy to landmines. For Charles, the end of the marriage represented both relief and reputational damage. He continued to fulfill royal engagements, pivoting toward environmental and architectural concerns that mattered to him. But the specter of Diana loomed whenever he appeared in public. He was the man who, in many people's eyes, had driven away the beloved princess through neglect and betrayal. While some recognized the complexities, broad sections of the public were less forgiving. The Queen, meanwhile, faced pressure to modernize aspects of the institution, to acknowledge that Britain had changed, that younger generations cared more about emotional authenticity than about preserving old formalities at any cost. Diana's death in August 1997 cut short any possibility of further resolution or reconciliation. Her fatal car accident in Paris, as paparazzi chased her vehicle, ignited a wave of grief and anger unprecedented in modern royal history. People converged on Buckingham Palace and Kensington Palace, laying mountains of flowers and heartfelt notes, demanding that the royals demonstrate genuine sorrow. When the Queen hesitated to return from Balmoral, the backlash suggested that centuries-old protocols no longer held the same sway. At Diana's funeral, watched by millions, the monarchy confronted a level of public scrutiny that forced them to adapt or risk a catastrophic loss of support. Charles walked behind the coffin with William and Harry in a scene still recalled as hauntingly emblematic of a fractured family united only in mourning. Amid the shock, many reevaluated how Diana's emotional distress might have been better addressed, or how Charles's hidden struggles had never truly been resolved. Over the subsequent years, Charles's image underwent a slow rehabilitation. He eventually married Camilla, who became queen consort. Still, the memories of this first marriage, its heartbreaks, revelations, and confessions, continued to color the public's view of him. Diana, in the popular imagination, metamorphosed into the people's princess, a figure who had supposedly challenged outdated traditions and revealed the need for more compassion and emotional openness in the royal family. Looking back, one can see that these 15 shocking secrets about Diana do not merely detail personal missteps or private heartbreaks. They represent a far more systemic problem. An ancient institution built on ceremony and secrecy found itself contending with a new media environment in which personal anguish could not be neatly hidden away. Diana's willingness to speak about her struggles, from bulimia to her suicidal impulses, shattered the unspoken rule that royals keep all vulnerabilities tightly locked behind palace walls. Charles, too, found that his attempts to bury or downplay certain truths became impossible once public interest soared. At times he resorted to quiet therapy sessions or official statements that seemed bland and unconvincing, only to realize that the wave of public curiosity could not be controlled by the monarchy's traditional brand of reticence. It is also worth highlighting how the monarchy's response, or lack thereof, to Diana's mental health concerns became emblematic of a larger cultural shift. In the decades that followed, mental health awareness soared, both globally and within the UK. Princes William and Harry have repeatedly spoken about their mother's influence on their emotional openness, with Harry especially vocal about feeling overshadowed and unprotected. In stepping away from official royal duties, Harry arguably invoked echoes of Diana's turmoil, suggesting the institution still struggles to accommodate individuality and emotional vulnerability. Though Diana's life ended far too soon, her story resonates through the monarchy's ongoing attempts to reconcile tradition with the realities of the modern world. The revelations regarding Charles's affair, Diana's bulimia, the Queen's directive to separate them, the Archbishop's failed intervention, and the involvement of their children are not standalone headlines, but chapters of a deeper saga. They illustrate what happens when two mismatched individuals, one shaped by rigid duty, the other yearning for affection and freedom, collide amid the cameras of a global audience. In the swirl of blame and heartbreak, some might suggest that the tragedy was inevitable. Charles, tied emotionally to Camilla from the start, had never fully committed to Diana in spirit. Diana, discovering the extent of this emotional detachment, channeled her anguish into public displays that forced the monarchy to adapt. Others see it as a scenario in which both were victims. Charles trapped by an archaic system requiring him to marry a suitable innocent bride, Diana left unsupported in a union that was never truly a partnership. Amid these layers, the monarchy sought to sustain its ancient grandeur. Divorce was frowned upon, controversies were to be confined to palace corridors, and mental health struggles were rarely, if ever, addressed openly. Diana upended these ideals, using the media to communicate her story, forcing the institution to confront modern values of transparency and empathy. In doing so, she inadvertently helped shift public expectations for the royal family, a shift that continues to this day. By the time they divorced, the notion of a fairy tale wedding had been irreparably replaced by images of a desperate young woman throwing herself downstairs, by glimpses of a prince unable or unwilling to show her compassion, and by headlines about secret tapes capturing Charles's private conversations with Camilla. And while the final break is often dated to the official separation and the subsequent legal divorce in 1996, the deeper emotional rupture likely began long before the wedding itself. Diana once allegedly admitted to close confidants that she discovered a bracelet Charles had commissioned for Camilla shortly before the ceremony, fueling her insecurities on the eve of her grand moment. In hindsight, that episode foreshadowed much of what was to come. For those seeking to make sense of this story, there is no neat resolution. The monarchy endures. Charles has finally ascended as King Charles III, and Camilla is queen consort, realities unthinkable in the mid-1880s. Meanwhile, Diana's memory remains deeply cherished by millions who identify with her vulnerabilities. Some prefer to see her purely as a victim of a cold family structure and a philandering husband. Others note her own manipulative strategies in the press or her sometimes erratic behavior. What is indisputable is that the union's breakdown and the cascade of revelations that accompanied it forced the Windsors into a new era, one where the power of public opinion and the importance of mental health could no longer be minimized. While each of these 15 revelations, her bulimia, the suicide attempts, Charles's confession of adultery, the mental health decline, Charles's private therapy, the embarrassing public disputes, the choice to live apart, her hostility toward his old friends, her adept manipulation of the press, her rising paranoia, the Queen's intervention urging separation, the Archbishop of Canterbury's failed mediation, the uneasy collaboration over their children, the unrelenting emotional and psychological strain, and Diana's attempt to ban Charles's beloved hobbies can be itemized as distinct truths. They are also interconnected. Each event fed into the next, creating a tapestry of sorrow, mistrust, and confrontation that neither party could fully undo. In the end, the raw data of this tragic marriage suggests an institution not built to accommodate personal fragility, a monarchy that prized stoic continuity above all else, and a pair of individuals who could never align their emotional needs with the roles they had to play. For Charles, the weight of centuries of tradition prescribed what he must be: a future king, a dutiful son, the upholder of a public image that demanded composure. For Diana, the recognition she craved as a beloved partner was marred by the ever-present shadow of Camilla and the palace's refusal to directly address her suffering. Adding even more dimension to this story is the reality that Diana's widespread public appeal, her compassion, her empathy, her willingness to touch those with HIV/AIDS at a time when few dared, contrasted with the monarchy's aloofness. This discrepancy drew more people to Diana's side, amplifying the notion that Charles and the institution he represented were out of touch. Over time, as she confided her anguish to biographers and interviewers, she emerged as a tragic heroine whose authenticity shone a harsh light on the monarchy's traditional hush-hush approach to scandal. When historians piece together the final chapters, including the heartbreak of Diana's fatal crash in 1997, they cannot ignore how these hidden truths shaped her final year. She was at that stage separated from Charles, forging new relationships, reportedly hoping to remarry someday and broadening her humanitarian commitments. The pursuit by paparazzi, famously culminating in that terrifying chase through the streets of Paris underscored the destructive appetites that had fueled so much of their story. Charles, though no longer directly involved in her life, found his own reputation battered yet again. As the world mourned Diana, public anger seethed, questioning whether the monarchy had done enough to protect her from a relentless media. In the more than 2 decades since, many have wondered if these tragedies could have been prevented through earlier support or counseling, or if the monarchy had recognized Diana's mental anguish as genuine rather than willful dramatics. Perhaps deeper empathy, more modern approaches to mental health, and a willingness to consider personal happiness over archaic ceremony might have rewritten the ending. Yet the monarchy has always derived part of its allure from its resistance to modern intrusions, preserving an air of mystique through tight-lipped composure. Only when confronted with a tidal wave of sympathy for Diana did it begin to edge toward greater openness. Today, Charles's kingship inevitably carries echoes of this past. While some segments of the British public and worldwide observers have accepted his second marriage to Camilla and see him as a grandfatherly figure invested in philanthropic projects, a substantial portion continues to remember the teenage princess he wed in 1981 and how that marriage unraveled. The monarchy's popularity fluctuates, but the lessons remain that sincerity matters, that mental health cannot be swept aside, and that illusions of perfection eventually crumble in an age where even whispered secrets can become global news. Taken in its totality, the saga reads almost like a Shakespearean drama, one of crown and heartbreak, of loyalty and betrayal, set in an era when media technologies accelerated the pace at which private turmoil became public spectacle. Diana and Charles embodied these contradictions. She was vulnerable yet incredibly popular. He was dutiful yet emotionally distant, and both found themselves entwined in a system that valued duty over human frailty. The tension between these roles propelled the monarchy into its greatest modern crisis, forcing an evolution that continues to shape the House of Windsor. Such an intricate web of heartbreak, defiance, and tradition cannot be neatly summarized. Still, the revelations remain potent reminders that behind the grandeur of crowns and palaces lie genuine human beings susceptible to pain and desperation. And while the monarchy has survived, largely by adapting its public relations strategies and acknowledging some of the criticisms that emerged, there is no escaping the enduring fascination with how Charles and Diana's story unraveled. People continue to revisit those days in the 1980s and 1990s, asking what might have been had Charles been more attuned, or if Diana had found effective mental health support in a more enlightened environment. These 15 secrets, then, are not just discrete anecdotes of scandal. They collectively portray a marriage in which each partner felt increasingly alienated, culminating in acts of self-harm, emotional warfare, institutional meddling, and a final sense of disillusionment. The monarchy, for its part, tried to manage these crises quietly until they could no longer do so. In that sense, the entire institution was tested by a marriage that defied its carefully groomed illusions, and by a princess who understood better than anyone how to harness public sentiment when her private pleas went unheard. Some voices within the palace have quietly conceded that Diana's plight forced a gradual but profound shift, prompting future generations of royals to discuss mental health issues more openly. Princes William and Harry have both indicated that losing their mother at a young age shaped their commitment to charitable causes and their willingness to bring personal struggles to the forefront. This new approach, though not always welcomed by the most traditional courtiers, aligns with the public's growing expectation of transparency from figures once enshrined behind regal walls. Looking forward, the monarchy's survival may well hinge on its ability to integrate the lessons gleaned from Charles and Diana's devastating experience. However complicated Charles's reign becomes, the collective memory of how he and Diana's union fell apart will remain a thread running through any discussions of modern royalty. And for many, Diana's enduring charisma still eclipses any official narrative. Her story resonates with individuals who see her as a relatable figure, a young woman thrust into an archaic environment, battling personal demons, and ultimately overshadowed by a system that sought to contain her. In closing, the revelations Charles allegedly sought to bury, whether it was Diana's bulimia, her suicidal desperation, his long-standing affair with Camilla, their bitter public disputes, her intensifying paranoia, the Queen's reluctant nod toward separation, or the Archbishop's attempt at peacemaking, paint a vivid portrait of how tension festers when authenticity is stifled. Diana's final attempts to ban Charles from the very hobbies he once found comforting simply underscore how far things had deteriorated, with both parties seeing each other's actions as threats or betrayals. Their children were the innocent witnesses left to navigate a labyrinth of parental conflict and public scrutiny. Yet even these haunting facts cannot fully contain the complexities of that doomed marriage. The story reverberates with references to older royal dramas, echoes of King Henry VIII's marital controversies, comparisons to Edward VIII's abdication for love, but in a new media-driven landscape where illusions disintegrated under constant tabloid revelation. King Charles III, decades later, has carved out a role for himself as a reflective monarch deeply invested in causes like climate change and cultural preservation. Camilla, similarly, has recast her public image through charitable engagements and discreet comportment. But the memory of Diana is as potent as ever, partly because the tragic dimensions of her life and death continue to captivate the world's imagination. In the end, this entire narrative, entwining heartbreak, mental health crises, hidden affairs, manipulative media strategies, and the slow pivot of a centuries-old monarchy, serves as both an unforgettable piece of modern history and a sobering reminder that fairy tales can disintegrate when the cameras are turned off. The union that once promised a renewed golden age for the British crown became its greatest modern trial, exposing raw human frailty behind the trappings of empire. Ultimately, the lessons gleaned from these 15 shocking secrets underscore the precarious nature of balancing personal well-being with institutional demands, and they remind us that no amount of regal splendor can wholly obscure the universal need for empathy, understanding, and genuine emotional support. Thank you for following this comprehensive chronicle of a marriage that began with jubilation and ended in sorrow, one that has left an indelible imprint on the British monarchy and continues to provoke debate, reflection, and fascination among audiences worldwide. In remembering how Diana's struggles collided with Charles's inherited responsibilities, we see both the resilience and fragility of royal life, and while no single perspective can fully encapsulate their story, these revelations offer a sobering window into the private anguish that shaped a union once billed as the wedding of the century. In a world hungry for spectacle, it stands as a testament that not even princes and princesses are immune to the toll of unaddressed emotional wounds, and that attempts to bury difficult truths often ensure they resurface all the more powerfully in the public eye.